James Rivera had
Hi
driven
there.
delivery routes through Rhode Island for 8 years, and nothing about that Tuesday morning suggested his life was about to fracture. Hey everyone, welcome to another story that proves truth really is stranger than fiction. If this tale moves you, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Your comments mean the world, so stick around until the end and let me know what you think. Now let's dive in. The GPS guided him through Providence's historic East Side, past colonial architecture that wealthy families had preserved like museum pieces. His van carried a shipment of imported Italian tile, the kind of luxury James and his wife Elena could never afford on their combined income. She worked as a school counselor in Queens. He hauled packages. They were happy, though. 22 years of marriage, 2 grown kids in college, a modest house with a garden Elena tended every Sunday. Simple. Solid. Real. Richard Westbrook's estate sprawled behind iron gates that opened automatically after James pressed the intercom. The mansion itself was something from a movie. White columns, manicured hedges, a circular driveway with a fountain at its center. James had delivered to wealthy homes before, but this felt different. Heavier somehow, as if the air itself carried weight. A housekeeper directed him through a side entrance to the study where the tiles would be installed. James wheeled his dolly down a corridor lined with artwork, the kind that probably cost more than his annual salary. He was focused on not scratching the hardwood when something stopped him cold. His hands went slack on the dolly handle. The photograph hung in an alcove between 2 windows, perfectly lit by morning sun. A girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with dark curls and eyes that held a particular warmth James recognized instantly. She wore a yellow dress with white flowers, one hand raised in a tentative wave. The smile was shy, hopeful. It was Elena. Not similar to Elena. It was her, exactly as she'd looked in the single childhood photo she kept in their bedroom drawer. James's heart hammered against his ribs. Elena had told him she had no childhood pictures, that everything had been lost when her foster home flooded years before they met. She rarely spoke about her early life, and James had learned not to push. Some wounds stayed tender. Beautiful, isn't she? Richard Westbrook's voice came from behind him, smooth and measured. The man was in his 60s, silver hair impeccably styled, wearing a cardigan that probably cost more than James's van. That's Isabella. My goddaughter. Isabella. James's voice sounded distant to his own ears. Isabella Moretti. Brilliant child. I knew her father, Thomas, wonderful man, taken far too soon. Richard's expression softened with what appeared to be genuine grief. She died in the same fire that killed him 26 years ago in Queens. I keep her photo to remember. The floor seemed to tilt beneath James's feet. Elena was 42. 26 years ago, she would have been 16, not dead. And she'd never mentioned a fire, never mentioned the name Isabella Moretti, never mentioned any of this. You all right? Richard stepped closer, concern creasing his features. You've gone pale. James forced words through his constricted throat. This girl, are you certain she died? I was at the funeral. Richard's tone carried finality. Why do you ask? Because she's my wife. Because I've kissed that face 10,000 times. Because I know the exact curve of that smile. But James couldn't say any of that. Instead, he pulled out his phone with trembling fingers and found a photo from last month. Elena in their garden, laughing as their daughter Sophie tried to teach her a TikTok dance. Richard's reaction was immediate and visceral. The color drained from his face. He reached for the nearest chair, gripping its back for support. That's impossible. Where did you get this? Who is this woman? Elena Rivera. My wife. We've been married 22 years. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications neither man wanted to voice. Richard's hand shook as he took James's phone, zooming in on Elena's face, comparing it to the portrait on his wall. The resemblance wasn't just striking, it was absolute. I need to sit down, Richard said finally. And you need to tell me everything you know about your wife's past. James sank into a leather chair across from the billionaire, his delivery forgotten. She says she grew up in foster care. No family, no records from before she was 12. She has nightmares sometimes. Always fire, always running. I thought they were just trauma from a bad childhood. Richard was silent for a long moment, his gaze moving between the phone and the portrait. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Thomas Moretti was my closest friend. He was an accountant who discovered something he shouldn't have, evidence of massive fraud. Before he could go public, his house burned. They told me Isabella died with him, that her body was found in the rubble. But if she didn't die, James couldn't finish the sentence. The implications were too enormous. Then someone wanted the world to believe she did. Richard stood abruptly, moving to his desk. And someone has kept that lie alive for 26 years. Mr. Rivera, I think your wife may have answers to questions I stopped asking decades ago. Questions about who killed my friend and why. James thought of Elena at home, probably preparing dinner, unaware that her husband had just stumbled into a truth that would shatter everything she believed about herself. He thought of their quiet life, their Sunday rituals, the way she sometimes stared into space, as if searching for something just beyond memory's reach. She doesn't know, he said quietly. Whatever happened, I don't think she remembers. Then we need to help her remember. Richard's expression hardened with purpose. Because if someone went to this much trouble to hide her, they had a reason. And Mr. Rivera, I suspect that reason is still out there, waiting. Elena was chopping vegetables for dinner when James walked through their front door 2 hours later than usual. She knew immediately something was wrong. 22 years of marriage taught you to read silence. And the silence James carried into their kitchen was deafening. Rough day? She asked, setting down her knife. Traffic on I-95? James didn't answer. Instead, he placed his phone on the counter between them, the screen displaying a photograph of a little girl in a yellow dress. Elena's hand moved to her throat involuntarily, a gesture she didn't understand. The room suddenly felt too small, too warm. Who is she? Elena's voice came out thin, uncertain. That's what I need you to tell me. James's tone was gentle but insistent. The man who owns that photo says her name was Isabella Moretti. Says she died 26 years ago in a house fire in Queens. The knife clattered from Elena's other hand to the cutting board. The name hit her like a physical blow. Isabella Moretti. And suddenly she was falling through layers of memory she didn't know existed. The kitchen dissolved around her. She was 7 years old, running through a house filled with smoke. Her father's voice shouting her name. Not Elena, but something else. Isabella, baby, this way. The heat was unbearable, flames licking up the walls of their Queens townhouse. Her father Thomas grabbed her hand, his face streaked with soot and terror. They had to get out, he kept saying. They had to run. Someone was coming. Elena. James's voice pulled her back, his hands steadying her shoulders. Baby, breathe. You're okay. You've got this. But she wasn't okay. The memories were flooding in now, unstoppable as a dam break. Her father worked with numbers, always numbers, staying up late at their kitchen table with ledgers and files. She remembered him on the phone one night, his voice low and urgent. Richard, if something happens to me, you have to promise, you'll look after Isabella. These people, they don't just destroy evidence. They destroy anyone who touches it. I remember, Elena whispered, tears streaming down her face. I remember running. Dad got me out through the back door, but then there were men. 2 men grabbed me, pulled me away from him. He was screaming, trying to reach me, and then, she choked on the words. Then the house exploded. The whole second floor just went up. I saw it. I saw him still inside. James guided her to a chair, kneeling before her. It's okay to feel scared. It's okay to not understand everything yet. We'll figure this out together. Elena's hands trembled as she took James's phone again, staring at the child she'd been. They put me in a car. A long drive. I kept crying for my dad, and one of the men, he kept telling me to shut up, that I was nobody now. That Isabella Moretti was dead, and I better learn to forget her. The fragments came faster now, sharper. A facility in Providence with bars on the windows and children who never smiled. A woman named Dorothy Brennan with cold eyes and colder hands, who told her repeatedly that she had no past, no family, that she'd been found wandering and should be grateful for a roof over her head. Months of being called Jane Doe until she chose a new name from a book, Elena, because it sounded like a girl who could be anyone, anywhere. They kept me there for 4 years, Elena said, her voice distant. In Providence. There were other kids, but we weren't allowed to talk about where we came from. Anyone who asked questions got locked in the basement. I learned fast to stop asking. James's jaw tightened. Who were these people? I don't know. Dorothy was in charge, but she answered to someone else. I remember once, a man came to inspect us, like we were livestock. He had a Rhode Island State Senate pin on his lapel. Dorothy called him senator, acted like he was royalty. He looked at me for a long time, said something about my eyes being marketable. I was 9 years old. The full horror of what she was describing settled over them both. Elena had spent decades believing she was simply an abandoned child who'd been lucky enough to find love with James. Now the truth rewrote her entire existence. When I was 12, they moved me to a foster home in New Jersey, Elena continued, the memories organizing themselves into coherent narrative. Dorothy drove me herself, gave the family an envelope of cash, and told them I was special inventory that needed to stay off radar. I didn't understand what that meant then. James's voice was rough with emotion. How did you get away? I didn't, not really. I just aged out of the system at 18. They lost interest once I wasn't a child anymore. I changed my last name legally, moved to Manhattan, worked 3 jobs to put myself through community college. I thought I was building a life from nothing. She laughed bitterly. I was actually just living in the shadow of my own murder. James pulled her into his arms, and Elena let herself break completely. 26 years of nightmares finally made sense. The inexplicable fear of fires, the panic attacks in crowds, the way she'd never been able to watch crime shows about missing children without feeling physically ill. Her subconscious had been screaming the truth her entire adult life, and she'd medicated it away with therapy and denial. Richard Westbrook, James said quietly. The man with the photo. He was your father's best friend. He thought you died too. Elena pulled back, wiping her eyes. My father mentioned him. That phone call. He asked Richard to protect me if something happened. But Richard never came. Nobody came. Because they told him you were dead. They staged it perfectly. James's expression hardened with a fury Elena rarely saw in her gentle husband. Your father found something, didn't he? Something worth killing for. Elena nodded slowly, another memory surfacing. Papers. He showed me once, said I needed to know where they were in case of emergency. Behind a loose brick in our basement. Financial records, he said. Proof that important people were stealing money. He made me memorize the address of a safety deposit box. She grabbed James's hand urgently. I still remember it. God help me. I still remember the number. The kitchen clock ticked into the silence that followed. Outside, their neighbor Mrs. Chun called her cat home. Somewhere down the street, children laughed. Normal life continuing while Elena's entire past rewrote itself. We need to call Richard, James said finally. And we need a lawyer. If what you're remembering is true, if there's really a trafficking ring that's been operating for decades, they'll come for me, Elena finished. Once they know I'm alive, they'll come to finish what they started. James cupped her face in his hands, his eyes fierce. Let them try. You survived once. This time, you won't be alone. Catherine Barnes had prosecuted criminals for 32 years, and she thought nothing could surprise her anymore. Then James Rivera and Richard Westbrook walked into her Boston office with a ghost, and she realized she'd been wrong. Elena sat between the two men, hands folded tightly in her lap, looking like she might bolt at any moment. Catherine recognized that posture. She'd seen it in trafficking survivors, in witnesses who'd spent decades hiding. The woman's story spilled out over the next 2 hours, and with each revelation, Catherine's initial skepticism transformed into cold, methodical rage. You're telling me Dorothy Brennan ran a Providence facility that disappeared children for 26 years, and nobody noticed? Catherine kept her voice even, professional, though her pen pressed so hard against her legal pad it nearly tore through. It wasn't official, Elena said quietly. It was a house on the east side, looked like any other foster placement. But the kids who went there, we weren't in the system. No records, no oversight. We were inventory. Richard leaned forward. I've spent the last week making calls. Thomas Moretti's house fire was ruled accidental, faulty wiring. But I found the original fire marshal's report. It was buried, but it's there. He noted signs of accelerant, recommended arson investigation. That recommendation was overridden by someone at the state level. Catherine made a note. Do you have that marshal's name? Dead. Heart attack, 6 months after the fire. He was 43 years old and ran marathons. The pieces were assembling themselves into a picture Catherine had seen before, though never at this scale. She'd prosecuted foster care abuse cases, corruption cases, even a small trafficking ring operating out of Connecticut. But this This suggested something vast and deeply rooted. Elena, you mentioned a senator came to inspect children. Can you describe him? Elena closed her eyes, pulling the memory forward. Tall, maybe 6'2". Gray hair even back then, so he'd be in his 70s now. He had a ring, gold with a blue stone, and a scar, right here. She touched her left eyebrow. Dorothy called him senator, but never used his name in front of us. Catherine was already typing on her laptop. Rhode Island senators, current and former, with physical descriptions. She pulled up photos, turned the screen toward Elena. Any of these? Elena scrolled slowly, then stopped. Her finger trembled as it touched the screen. Him. Senator Lawrence Voss. That's him. Catherine's blood went cold. Lawrence Voss had served Rhode Island for 38 years, recently retired amid fanfare and honors. He sat on boards, attended charity galas, was frequently photographed with governors and presidential candidates. He also owned property in Providence, Connecticut, and New Jersey, a detail that suddenly felt sickeningly relevant. He's still alive, Catherine said grimly. Lives in Providence, very visible, very protected by decades of political capital. James's voice was tight with anger. So what do we do? How do we prove any of this? Catherine stood, walking to her office window. Below, Boston traffic flowed through Government Center, ordinary people living ordinary lives. We build the case brick by brick. Elena, you said other children were at that facility. Any names you remember? First names only. Katie, Marcus, Chun. We weren't allowed surnames. But there was one girl, older than me. Amanda. She was 15, said she'd been there since she was 8. She told me they moved kids around, Providence to Connecticut to Massachusetts to New Jersey. Different facilities, same system. Did Amanda say why? What was the purpose? Elena's voice dropped to barely a whisper. Adoption, but not the legal kind. She said rich people who couldn't get approved through normal channels would pay for kids. 6 figures for the right child. And some kids, her voice broke. Some kids didn't go to families at all. Amanda heard Dorothy on the phone once, talking about medical compatibility, tissue matching. The implications hung in the air like poison. Catherine had heard whispers of such things, nightmare scenarios that kept prosecutors awake at night. Black market adoptions, funding organ harvesting operations, children valued not as human beings, but as biological inventory. Richard's face had gone pale. Thomas discovered financial irregularities in accounts tied to several East Coast charities. He thought it was simple embezzlement, but if these charities were fronting for trafficking, then he found the money trail, Catherine finished. And they killed him for it. Elena, you said your father mentioned a safety deposit box. Elena nodded. Bank of America, Queens Branch on Northern Boulevard. Box 347. He made me memorize it when I was 6. Catherine reached for her phone. I have contacts at the FBI. If that box still exists, if Thomas's evidence is still in it, we might have enough to start subpoenaing records. She paused, meeting Elena's eyes directly. But you need to understand, once we start this, there's no stopping. These people have protected their operation for decades. They have resources, connections, political cover. They'll come after you with everything they have. They already took my father, Elena said, steel entering her voice. They took my childhood, my identity, my past. I've spent 26 years running from nightmares I couldn't name. I'm done running. Over the next 3 weeks, Catherine assembled her team like a general preparing for war. The FBI opened an investigation after agents found Thomas Moretti's safety deposit box exactly where Elena remembered. Inside were ledgers documenting millions in suspicious transactions flowing through nonprofit organizations registered in Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New Jersey. Wire transfers to offshore accounts. Invoices marked with codes like special placement and premium acquisition. More damning were Thomas's handwritten notes. He'd been tracking the money backward from a D.C. lobbying firm that contracted with the charities, discovering that several Maryland political families had made substantial donations coinciding with what appeared to be private adoptions. Children who never appeared in official records but showed up suddenly in wealthy households with forged birth certificates. Catherine brought in forensic accountants who traced the shell companies. Every thread led back to Rhode Island, to properties owned by subsidiaries of subsidiaries, with Lawrence Voss's signature appearing just often enough to establish a pattern. The man had been careful, but not careful enough. Then came the breakthrough Catherine had been praying for. A woman named Grace Chen walked into the FBI field office in New Hampshire, saying she'd seen Elena's story on the news. Grace had escaped from a New Jersey facility 15 years ago, pregnant at 16 and desperate. She'd given birth in secret, changed her name, and spent years looking over her shoulder. But she had documentation, photos of the facility, names of handlers, even a ledger she'd stolen showing payments received for 6 children placed in Maryland and Virginia. Dorothy Brennan signed these receipts, Grace said, pushing the papers across Catherine's desk. And she wasn't working alone. There was a woman from Connecticut, a man from Massachusetts. This went up and down the East Coast. Providence was just the hub. Catherine looked at Elena, who'd insisted on being present for every interview. You ready for this? Once we file charges, once we bring Dorothy and Voss in, your face will be everywhere. Your story will be public. Elena reached for James's hand. I've been dead for 26 years. It's time Isabella Moretti came back to life. The Providence courthouse buzzed with an energy Catherine Barnes had rarely witnessed in 3 decades of prosecution. Media trucks lined the streets, reporters jostling for position as federal marshals escorted Dorothy Brennan and Lawrence Voss through side entrances. The case had exploded across national headlines. Rhode Island trafficking ring exposed. Senator linked to decades-long child exploitation network. Woman returns from the dead to testify against captors. Elena sat in the front row of the gallery, James on one side and Richard on the other. She'd spent the previous 2 months in depositions, walking investigators through every horrific memory that had surfaced. The nightmares had intensified, but so had her resolve. Catherine watched her client, no, her witness, her survivor, and felt a fierce pride that transcended professional duty. All rise, the bailiff announced as Judge Morrison entered. The trial was beginning. Dorothy Brennan looked smaller in her orange jumpsuit than Elena remembered. The woman who'd terrorized children for decades now sat hunched at the defense table, avoiding eye contact with the gallery. Lawrence Voss, by contrast, maintained his senatorial bearing, tailored suit, confident posture, an expression that suggested this was all a terrible misunderstanding that would shortly be cleared up. Catherine stood for her opening statement, addressing the jury with quiet intensity. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about power. The power to erase a child's identity. The power to turn human beings into commodities. The power to maintain a lie for 26 years. She gestured toward Elena. That woman should not exist. According to official records, Isabella Moretti died in 1999. But she's here, alive, ready to tell you exactly how a 7-year-old girl was stolen and replaced with a ghost. The prosecution's case unfolded methodically over 2 weeks. FBI agents testified about the financial records Thomas Moretti had hidden, shell companies, offshore accounts, money flowing through fake charities. Forensic experts explained how the arson at the Moretti house had been disguised as an electrical fire. Richard took the stand, his voice breaking as he described identifying a body he'd been told was Isabella, later revealed through DNA analysis to have been another child entirely, a Jane Doe whose murder remained unsolved. Then came the survivors. Grace Chen testified first, describing her captivity in the New Jersey facility and the night she'd overheard Dorothy discussing prices with a Maryland contact. She said the family wanted a girl, blonde, under 3 years old. She had one available for $75,000. I remember thinking, that's what we're worth to them. A price tag. 3 more survivors followed, each describing similar experiences across different states. The network had operated like a well-oiled machine. Children acquired through kidnapping, falsified death certificates, or simply plucked from vulnerable situations where their disappearance wouldn't trigger investigations. Providence served as the central hub, with Voss using his political connections to block inquiries and manipulate records. When Elena finally took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. Catherine guided her through the testimony with care, watching for signs of distress, but finding only steely determination. Ms. Rivera, or should I say, Ms. Moretti, please tell the jury what happened the night of the fire. Elena's voice was steady, clear. My father came to my room around midnight. He said we had to leave immediately, that people were coming who wanted to hurt us. We made it to the back door, but 2 men were waiting. They grabbed me, pulled me away from him. I heard him screaming my name as they dragged me to a car. Then I saw the explosion. The whole house, Her voice caught, but she pushed through. The whole house went up in flames. They killed him while I watched. And where did these men take you? Providence. To a house on Benefit Street. Dorothy Brennan was waiting. She told me Isabella Moretti was dead, that if I wanted to survive, I'd forget I ever had that name. Catherine approached the witness stand. During your time at that facility, did you ever see the defendant Lawrence Voss? Yes. He came 3 times that I remember. He'd walk through, examining us like we were merchandise. Once, he pulled me aside, looked at my teeth, checked my hands. Asked Dorothy if I had any medical issues. She told him I was healthy, premium stock. I was 8 years old. The jury shifted uncomfortably. Several members glared at Voss, whose composure was finally beginning to crack. Did you ever learn what happened to the other children at the facility? Elena nodded. Some were sent to foster homes. Real ones, I think, in New Jersey and Massachusetts. But others, Dorothy had a list she kept locked in her desk. I saw it once when she left her office door open. Names, dates, and besides some of them, destinations. I remember one entry. Isabella M. Maryland placement, pending medical clearance, $50,000 advance received. The courtroom erupted. Judge Morrison gavelled for order, but the damage was done. Elena had just testified that she'd been sold, that money had changed hands for her life. Catherine let the moment breathe before asking her final question. Ms. Moretti, why do you think that placement never happened? Why were you kept in foster care instead? I think my father's evidence scared them, Elena said. As long as people were looking for answers about the fire, I was too dangerous to move. So they buried me in the system, kept me close where they could watch me. When I aged out at 18, they probably figured the statute of limitations and my suppressed memories would protect them. She looked directly at Voss. They were wrong. The defense attorneys tried to discredit her. Repressed memories were unreliable, they argued. Elena had been a traumatized child. Perhaps she'd confused faces, invented villains to explain her suffering. But Catherine was ready. She called a neuropsychologist who explained how traumatic memory worked, how Elena's nightmares and panic attacks had been her mind's attempt to process buried truth. She presented the physical evidence, the ledgers, the wire transfers, the testimony of multiple survivors whose stories corroborated Elena's in every material detail. Then came the prosecution's final witness, Dorothy Brennan herself, granted partial immunity in exchange for testimony against Voss. The woman was crying before Catherine even asked the first question. Ms. Brennan, how long did you work for Lawrence Voss? 28 years. Dorothy's voice was barely audible. And what was your role in his organization? Acquisition and placement. I managed the Providence facility and coordinated with handlers in Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New Jersey. We'd receive children, some kidnapped, some purchased from desperate parents, some taken from hospitals, and prepare them for placement with buyers. Tell the jury about Isabella Moretti. Dorothy's hands shook. Senator Voss gave me that job personally. Thomas Moretti had discovered financial irregularities that could expose the entire network. The order was to eliminate him and acquire his daughter. There was a Maryland family, a congressman's brother and his wife, who wanted a girl matching Isabella's description. They'd already paid $50,000, with another $50,000 due on delivery. So Isabella was merchandise to be sold? Yes. What went wrong? Dorothy wiped her eyes. The fire got too much attention. Moretti had friends, people asking questions. Voss decided it was too risky to move her immediately. He told me to keep her at the facility until things cooled down. Years passed, and she just stayed. Eventually, she became another foster case nobody tracked. By the time Voss considered reviving the Maryland placement, Isabella was too old. The congressman's family wanted a young child they could raise as their own. Catherine's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. So to be clear, Isabella Moretti survived only because murdering her father created too much heat? If the investigation had been less thorough, she would have been delivered to Maryland buyers and her disappearance never questioned. Yes. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. When they returned, their verdict was unanimous. Dorothy Brennan, guilty on all counts, including kidnapping, child trafficking, and conspiracy to commit murder. Lawrence Voss, guilty on 23 counts spanning 3 decades of exploitation. But Catherine's work wasn't finished. As Voss was led away in handcuffs, FBI agents were executing simultaneous raids across 4 states. A Connecticut handler was arrested at his home. A Massachusetts facility operator was taken into custody at the airport, attempting to flee to Hawaii. And in Providence, at Voss's private residence, agents discovered files documenting over 200 placements, 200 children whose lives had been stolen and sold. Judge Morrison handed down the sentences 3 weeks later. Dorothy Brennan received 35 years. Lawrence Voss, now 74, received life without parole. As marshals escorted him from the courtroom, he finally looked at Elena. For a moment, their eyes met. Predator and survivor, captor and freed captive. Elena didn't flinch. Outside the courthouse, Elena stood before a wall of microphones and cameras. James held her hand as she read from a prepared statement. "My name is Isabella Moretti," she began, reclaiming the identity stolen from her. "For 26 years, I was a ghost. Today, I'm real again. And I'm here to tell every survivor still hiding, still afraid, you're not alone. Your story matters. Your truth matters. And no one, not senators or systems or shadows, gets to erase you." 3 years after the trial, Elena stood in a conference room in Washington, D.C., addressing a congressional committee on foster care reform. She'd traveled far from that queen's kitchen where her past had shattered and reassembled, literally and metaphorically. Behind her sat James, steady as always, and Richard, who'd become the grandfather her children never had. Catherine Barnes sat in the gallery, watching her star witness transform into an advocate whose voice carried weight in the halls of power. Elena's foundation, Isabella's Light, had identified 47 survivors from the Rhode Island network, providing them with legal assistance, therapy, and most importantly, validation. She'd pushed for interstate tracking protocols that made it nearly impossible for children to vanish between state lines. Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Jersey, and Rhode Island had all adopted her recommended safeguards, and Maryland was finalizing similar legislation. The investigation's ripples continued spreading. The Maryland congressman whose family had nearly purchased her resigned amid scandal. The D.C. lobbying firm that funneled money through fake charities collapsed under federal scrutiny. And in a Providence prison, Dorothy Brennan provided testimony that led to 12 additional arrests, including 2 judges and a child services administrator who'd spent decades enabling the network. But the victories carried weight. Elena still woke some nights reaching for James, her breath caught in her throat, the smell of smoke flooding her senses. Therapy helped, but some scars ran deeper than treatment could reach. She'd learned to hold both truths, that she'd survived, and that survival came with a cost. Richard visited their Queens home every Sunday now, joining the family dinners he'd missed for 26 years. He'd established a scholarship in Thomas Moretti's name for accounting students dedicated to forensic fraud investigation, ensuring her father's legacy lived beyond tragedy. Sometimes, over coffee, he'd tell Elena stories about her father, his terrible jokes, his love of jazz, the way his face lit up whenever he talked about his daughter. Richard was giving her back the childhood stolen from her, one memory at a time. Grace Chun and the other survivors formed a tight circle, supporting each other through flashbacks and fear. They celebrated birthdays together, marked anniversaries of their testimonies, and reminded one another that they'd done the impossible. They'd faced their monsters and won. Several had reunited with families who'd spent decades mourning them. Others, like Elena, had built new families from scratch. All of them were learning that survival wasn't just about staying alive. It was about choosing to truly live. James had retired from delivery driving, now managing Isabella's Lights operations. He joked that he'd finally made that fateful delivery, not Italian tile to a mansion, but truth to his wife's life. Their children, Sophie and David, had struggled initially with their mother's revealed past, but ultimately found strength in her courage. Sophie was studying criminal justice, determined to continue her mother's work. David volunteered at foster care advocacy groups, ensuring current children had voices their mother had been denied. On the 3rd anniversary of the verdict, Elena returned to Providence. Not to the courthouse, but to Benefit Street, to the house where she'd been imprisoned. It had been seized by the government, slated for demolition. Catherine had arranged for Elena to walk through one final time before the wreckers arrived. The rooms were empty now, stripped of furniture and ghosts. Elena moved through them slowly, James beside her, reclaiming space that had once held only terror. She stood in the room where she'd slept, where she'd cried silently into her pillow, where she'd whispered her real name to herself like a prayer. Isabella Moretti, she said aloud now, her voice echoing off bare walls. Isabella Moretti survived. They left flowers on the front step, not for the building, but for the children who hadn't made it, whose names appeared in Voss's files beside notations like medical complications or placement canceled. Elena had spent 3 years trying to identify them, to give them back their names and dignity. Some remained mysteries, Jane and John Does, whose families never knew what happened. She carried them with her, promised them she wouldn't let the world forget. The moral of this journey wasn't simple revenge or even justice. It was something deeper. Elena had learned that truth, however painful, held more power than any lie, no matter how carefully constructed. She'd discovered that love, James's unwavering support, Richard's determined search for his goddaughter, Catherine's fierce advocacy, could survive even decades of enforced forgetting. And she'd proven that the powerless, given voice and platform, could dismantle systems that seemed invincible. "You've got this," James whispered as they walked back to their car, Providence's skyline glowing in the sunset. It was the same thing he'd said that terrible day in their kitchen when her world shattered. Except now, Elena knew he was right. She'd always had it. The strength, the resilience, the unbreakable core that no amount of cruelty could fully extinguish. Isabella Moretti had been stolen at 7, erased at 8, buried under a false identity for decades. But Elena Rivera had built a life worth living, and together, Isabella and Elena, past and present woven into one, she'd become someone neither her captors nor her younger self could have imagined. A survivor, a voice, a light in the darkness for others still finding their way home. Before you go, remember to hit that like button if this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel for more powerful narratives, and share this with anyone who needs to hear that survival is possible, that truth wins, and that no one is ever truly erased as long as someone remembers. Drop a comment below. I read every single one, and your stories matter too. Until next time, take care of yourself and each other. This story reminds us that our past doesn't define our future, but reclaiming our truth can transform both. No matter how deeply buried identity persists, no matter how powerful the oppressor, courage and community can bring them down. And no matter how lost we feel, love anchors us home. You are stronger than you know, braver than you believe, and worthy of every truth you seek. Keep going. Your story isn't over yet.